The sky is filled with smoke. Sirens echo across the river. From above, Portland looks less like a city and more like a question mark burning on the edge of the republic. The anchors say the words again, federal deployment, and the phrase lands like a punch. For months, demonstrations had filled American streets. Anger over police violence had bled into anger about inequality, about power, about who owns the right to stand and speak. Governors asked for calm, mayors begged for resources. Then, one afternoon, the president stepped before cameras and announced that the time for patience was over. If the cities can't control themselves, he said, the federal government will. Those 14 words split the nation in two. By nightfall, convoys of federal agents in camouflage were moving through Portland's downtown corridors. They wore no name tags, carried no visible identification, and answered only to agencies whose acronyms most citizens barely recognized: ICE, DHS, FPS. Their mandate was written in the fog of law and order, but their presence spoke the older language of command. Phones filmed everything. Unmarked vans pulling protesters from sidewalks, tear gas seeping beneath apartment doors, the crack of rubber bullets. Within hours, the footage raced across social media and cable screens, and the world saw something Americans had not expected to see on their own soil. Federal force operating without invitation inside a sovereign state. The president's press secretary called it a defensive action to protect federal property. Supporters hailed him as the only leader willing to impose discipline on a nation that had, in their eyes, lost it. Yet for others, the sight of armed men without badges felt like a premonition, as if the Constitution itself were being frisked and detained. Among those who refused to accept that new normal was a first-term Congresswoman from Texas, Jasmine Crockett. She had been elected less for her seniority than for her ferocity, a former public defender who had built her career cross-examining authority. Watching the videos from Portland, she felt the same knot in her stomach that she had once felt in courtrooms when prosecutors stretched the law to fit their story. She recognized the pattern, power improvising its own permission. Reporters followed, shouting questions. She answered only one. If the federal government can occupy a city without consent, she said, then the 10th Amendment is a souvenir, not a safeguard. The remark traveled faster than the tear gas. That week, Oregon's Attorney General filed an emergency suit seeking to block further deployments. The case landed before federal judge Ann Aiken, a jurist known for her cautious prose and her unwillingness to yield to hysteria. In a late-night ruling, she issued a temporary restraining order against the federal expansion, citing the 10th Amendment's protection of state sovereignty. For one brief moment, Parchment pushed back against power. The president responded the next morning with a tweet that began in capital letters, "Law and order." It ended with a promise to protect America, whether the radicals like it or not. The radicals, apparently, included anyone who questioned him. Jasmine Crockett did not answer online. She went on television instead, sitting beneath the sterile studio lights that flatten every human expression into geometry. The question isn't whether the president can keep order, she said, but whether he still recognizes the limits that keep America from becoming something else. Her tone was calm, almost surgical, but each sentence cut. It was about geometry, the architecture of the republic. The federal structure of the United States was designed to distribute power horizontally to prevent any single authority from rising unchecked. But 2 centuries of emergencies had built vertical ladders inside that architecture. Wartime powers, surveillance statutes, national security exemptions. Every rung made it easier for a president to climb above the balance. Trump had not invented that ladder. He had simply decided to stand on its top rung and declare it solid ground. Crockett saw the danger. The 10th Amendment, she said, was not a courtesy to the states, but a constraint on the throne. To ignore it was to forget that America was founded by people who had once been subjects. At rallies, Trump mocked her as another liberal lawyer who hates cops. She responded without naming him, saying only that law enforcement is strongest when it enforces the law on itself. The clash was personal, only because the stakes were universal. 2 visions of leadership stood in opposition, one that believed unity required submission, and one that believed unity required consent. The difference may have seemed rhetorical, but nations have risen and fallen on smaller distinctions. Meanwhile, the protests spread. In Seattle, Chicago, Albuquerque, and even Dallas, federal agents appeared at courthouses and transit hubs. Local officials complained that coordination was impossible. No one could tell who commanded whom. The Department of Homeland Security released a statement referring to the deployments as protective measures. The phrase sounded sterile, bureaucratic, and infinitely elastic. Crockett seized on that elasticity. In interviews, she compared it to the legal loopholes that once allowed surveillance programs to expand beyond their mandate. Every abuse begins with a euphemism, she said. Protective measure, enhanced interrogation, necessary force, different words, same permission slip. Her insistence on precision turned her into both lightning rod and teacher. Conservative media caricatured her as reckless. Yet across the political spectrum, an unease began to grow. If the federal government could act unilaterally in Oregon today, what prevented it from acting unilaterally anywhere tomorrow? When Judge Aiken's restraining order expired, the administration pushed again, arguing that the president possessed inherent authority under the Insurrection Act. But the conditions required for that act, insurrection, rebellion, the collapse of state governance, did not exist. Crockett stood on the House floor and read from the Posse Comitatus Act aloud. Her colleagues fidgeted as if the words themselves were subversive. Whoever, she read, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, uses any part of the Army or Air Force as a Posse Comitatus shall be fined or imprisoned. She closed the book. That law was written to prevent exactly this moment, she said, a president mistaking the country for a battlefield. The clip ran on every network. For a generation that had learned civics through outrage, it felt like a rediscovery of grammar, the syntax of limits. Still, the machinery of narrative moved faster than the machinery of law. The White House communications team released a montage of burning buildings edited over martial drums, captioned, "Chaos in the Democrats' cities." The message was simple. Only strength can stop disorder. The video spread online in minutes. Crockett answered not with counter-propaganda, but with patience. She held town halls, streamed live, listening to constituents who feared both the protesters and the president. She explained that the issue was not about liking or disliking authority, but about defining it. If the government can treat any dissent as an emergency, she said, then emergencies will never end. Trump remained undeterred. In rallies across the Rust Belt, he told crowds that anarchists were taking over the cities and that he alone had the courage to stop them. The crowds roared back the chant he loved most, law and order. It thundered through stadiums like liturgy. But law and order are not synonyms for justice. Crockett repeated that sentence until it felt carved into the air. She argued that the rule of law was being replaced by the rule of the ruler. When the government breaks its own rules in order to save them, she said, that's not preservation, it's mutation. Judge Aiken ruled that the federal deployments had indeed overstepped constitutional bounds. The opinion was dry, technical, and devastating. It reaffirmed that state sovereignty could not be suspended by executive decree. The decision forced a gradual withdrawal of federal agents from Oregon. Cable commentators declared victory for the rule of law. Others warned that the precedent was fragile. Crockett addressed the press with her characteristic mixture of triumph and restraint. Power, she said, is like fire. It illuminates until it forgets why it was lit. Yet she did not gloat. Instead, she turned the spotlight outward towards citizens. Don't thank the courts, she said. Thank yourselves for paying attention. The law only works when people notice it's being broken. That was the real breakthrough, the realization that democracy is not self-executing. The Portland episode became more than a local dispute. It became a mirror held up to the entire American experiment. For years, citizens had spoken of federalism as a dusty abstraction, a chapter in a civics book. Now it had shape and sound boots on pavement, sirens in the fog, a constitution recited aloud by a congresswoman who refused to whisper. The line between Washington and the states was no longer theoretical, it was traced in tear gas and litigation. Crockett argues that democracy is dying not because of evil people, but because of the public's harmful habits, the habit of trusting power and the habit of silence. Meanwhile, Trump uses confrontation to consolidate power, using strong language about domestic enemies as a rhythm of fear to incite his supporters. The press and scholars are indulged in arguing legal precedents, warning of the dangers of dictatorship under the cover of a state of emergency. This is the greatest danger, because history teaches that silence is when liberty sleeps. Crockett refused to let it sleep. She spoke not only of Trump, but of every president who might come after him. Today it's Portland, she said. Tomorrow it could be your town, your protest, your right. She pointed out that both parties had, over decades, expanded executive power, Democrats in the name of progress, Republicans in the name of security. Power doesn't care what label you give it, she warned. It only cares that you stop watching. Crockett's own journey transformed from political skirmish to moral crusade. She began touring states far from her own district, meeting citizens who had nothing in common except distrust of unchecked authority. Conservatives in Idaho thanked her for defending state rights. Progressives in New York thanked her for defending civil rights. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down on the narrative of siege. He described himself as the last barrier between civilization and chaos. They hate me because I protect you, he told his audiences, and the crowds believed it. The paradox was exquisite. A leader presenting absolute power as a form of self-sacrifice. It was theology dressed as politics. Crockett claimed, democracy doesn't die in darkness, she told a graduating class. It dies in boredom. Don't get bored. Her optimism was cautious but real. She knew the machinery of government would always tempt whoever sat in the Oval Office. Yet she also believed that every confrontation left a residue of vigilance. We remember the bruises longer than the victories, she said. That's how republics heal. Trump continued to defend his decisions. He argued that without strong intervention, American cities would have descended into chaos. History will thank me, he said. Maybe it will. But history is written by the balance between memory and myth, and Jasmine Crockett had already ensured that another version of memory existed. In that version, the lesson is not that presidents should act boldly, but that citizens should think critically. That the federal government is not a father figure, but a hired servant. That the Constitution is not a relic, but a contract renewed every time someone says no. When Crockett returned to Washington, she walked again through the marble corridors, the same Constitution in her hand. Reporters asked what she had learned. "That power is not a possession," she said. "It's a loan, and the lenders are watching." In a later speech on the House floor, she addressed not her opponents, but her allies. "Someday," she said, "we'll have a Democratic president who wants to use these same powers for something we believe in. Promise me you'll say no then too." The silence that followed was not disagreement, it was recognition. That sentence may prove her most important legacy. In a culture addicted to victory, she reminded everyone that restraint is also a form of strength. The crowd rarely cheers for the referee, but without the referee, there is no game. As years pass, the Portland affair will shrink in memory, overtaken by new crises. Yet its moral residue lingers in every debate about surveillance, policing, and protest. The question remains the same: how far can the federal hand reach before it forgets whose hand it is? The American answer has never been final. It swings like a pendulum between fear and freedom, unity and autonomy. But in that motion lies the nation's endurance. Every generation redraws the line, and every redraw proves that the line still matters. One evening, long after the hearings ended, a documentary crew followed Crockett through her district. They filmed her visiting schools, community centers, small law offices. In one scene, she stopped beside a mural of herself painted during the height of the protests. Someone had added beneath her likeness a single word: watch. She smiled. "That's all it takes," she said. "Just keep watching." The final voiceover of that documentary captured the paradox of the American Republic. A nation powerful enough to police the world, yet fragile enough to tremble before its own reflection. The narrator spoke of a president who believed order could be imposed from above, and a congresswoman who believed order must rise from consent. Between them stretched the living distance of democracy. That distance is not failure, it is the space where freedom breathes. So the story ends not with a verdict, but with a vow. That the next time armored vehicles roll down city streets, someone will remember a summer when law was nearly mistaken for war. That the next time a leader invokes emergency, citizens will ask whose emergency it really is. That the next time the Constitution is quoted, it will be by someone who still believes its promises belong to everyone. In that promise, there is hope. Because nations are not judged by how often they stumble, but by how quickly they stand again and question the direction of their march. America's march is noisy, uneven, and endlessly self-correcting. And that, perhaps, is its secret strength. Freedom does not survive through purity. It survives through persistence. Every protest, every court case, every argument in the halls of power is a rehearsal for responsibility. The Republic endures not because its leaders are wise, but because its citizens refuse to be passive. And as long as there are voices like Jasmine Crockett's questioning, insistent, unwilling to accept silence as stability, then even the loudest drums of authority cannot drown out the heartbeat of liberty. The monuments of Washington still gleam at night, their white stones stained by centuries of rain. They remind us that democracy is not marble, it is motion. It lives only as long as people move toward it, argue for it, fight to keep it honest. That is the legacy of the summer when federal agents stormed the states, a reminder that the Constitution is not a shield behind glass, but a living document in human hands, fragile, fallible, and worth defending. And so the story closes where it began, beneath a sky filled with sirens and questions. The same questions the founders asked, the same ones each generation must answer again. Who guards the guardians? Who limits the limitless? Who says no when power says yes? As long as those questions echo, the Republic still stands. And that echo, fierce, imperfect, unending, is the sound of freedom itself. Like, share and subscribe to the channel. We will meet again in the next stories where truth speaks before power.